This is Examine Sport, a podcast of the sports ethicist. I am your host, Sean Klein. Each episode of Examine Sport focuses on a paper in the philosophy of sport literature. We look at classic discipline-defining articles, exciting newly published works, and dig deep for important but not as well-known papers. You can subscribe, comment, and find an archive of all shows, along with links and related information at sportsethicist.com. In this episode of Examine Sport, I examine the central ideas of Robert Simon's article, Internalism and Internal Values in Sport. Published in the Journal of Philosophy of Sport in 2000, this article was based on Simon's presidential address of the annual meeting of the International Association for the Philosophy of Sport in 1999. Now, Simon modestly claims that there's little new or original in his paper, and that he's merely pulling together the work of others to provide a framework for understanding values in sport. Now, in some ways, this is accurate. Simon draws on the works of many key thinkers in earlier theories. But the integration of these views into the framework that Simon calls broad internalism was and is an important development in the philosophy of sport. This paper, or rather the ideas and framework Simon presented in it, becomes the guiding set of principles for a philosophy of sport for the better part of 2 decades. Now, the starting point for Simon is the question, how is sport connected to values? Now, certainly sport is an activity valued by most human cultures. Sport is said to promote and inculcate values from character building to patriotism. Sports and values are clearly somehow connected, but what is the source of these values for sport? To what do we appeal to connect sport and values? Now, the first position that Simon discusses is what he calls externalism. Now, Simon says of externalism that it denies that sport is a special source of values, and that, quote, the values sport promotes or expresses simply mirror, reflect, or reinforce the values found in the wider society, end quote. As the name of the position suggests, the values, or more precisely, the source and justification of these as values, are external to sport. According to externalism, what makes, for example, the psychological resilience of a relief pitcher called in to close out the inning with the bases loaded, or the soccer goalie facing down a penalty kick, what makes that psychological resilience something we mark as a value is that psychological resilience is something valued by society. In short, what is valued in society is also valued by sport. And what is valued in sport is valued in sport precisely because it is valued in society. Now, while this seems true for many kinds of values, it doesn't account for all values. Some values in sport might subvert or run counter to the values in society more generally. So these values can't just be a mirror of society or an expression of those general social values. How do we account for this? Well, sport, says internalism, must have some autonomy from the value system of society and be something that, quote, supports, stands for, or expresses a set of values of its own, end quote. Now, these values are internal to the sport. They arise out of, or are justified by, or only understandable in terms of the underlying principles, structure, or form of the sport itself. This gives the values independence from society more generally and provides an internal mechanism or foundation by which to evaluate sport on its own terms. Now, Simon first discusses formalism as a kind of internalism. Now, formalism is the set of positions that, quote, characterize games and game derivative notions primarily in terms of their formal structure and particularly their constitutive rules. Sports, as kinds of games, are, quote, defined primarily by reference to the idea of constitutive rules and goals or obstacles designated by the rules themselves, which are unintelligible apart from them, end quote. Now, sports are activities created by and bounded by a set of rules. These rules set the terms and conditions of what is allowed and what is not allowed in the game, what the aim or goals of the players are, what the means to these aims must be. These rules create or constitute the game, and according to a formalism, allow us to make sense of and evaluate what happens in the game. Now, since rules and structures of games are internal to the game, formalism is a kind of internalism. It is a narrow form, though, because it focuses only on the known rules of the games to do all the work. Now, this is helpful so far as it goes, but Simon points out that there are many situations that arise in sport that formalism on its own seems unable to address. And Simon presents 3 such cases. There's the case of clubless Josie, the case of strategic fouls, and the cases of rule change or modification to the rules. Each of these, according to Simon, highlights a way that formalism, in order to answer these cases, must move beyond its narrow focus on the internal structure and constitutive rules of the game. The case of clubless Josie, which Simon adapts from a Robert Butcher and Angela Schneider article, is about an amateur golfer who, due to some airline error, ends up at a major tournament without her clubs. Josie's chief rival, Annika, however, happens to have an extra set of nearly identical clubs that would allow Josie to compete. So the question is, should Annika lend the clubs to Josie or not? Right? And is there something wrong in her not doing so? Or is she obligated to do so? How do we address that question? But formalism seems silent on this case, since it's not about the application of rules, assuming there's no rule about the lending or not lending of clubs. It is instead about sportsmanship and the spirit of sport. But these are not rules, and so formalism seems to have nothing to say. Now, in the case of strategic fouls, we have rule violations used by players to gain some competitive advantage. The classic case is the foul committed in basketball towards the end of a close game. Such fouls are committed to stop the game clock and get possession back of the ball in an attempt to close the gap in the score. Now, the formalist analysis, however, seems counterintuitively to require that we see this common and widely accepted practice as illegitimate, as tantamount to cheating. The game is defined by its rules. It must be the case that one cannot be allowed to violate these rules with impunity and gain an advantage. Now, lastly, since formalism is based on the existing structure and rules of the game, it's at best unclear how we can evaluate new or modified rules. The rules might provide a basis for making rule changes, but the rules on their own are incapable of telling us whether or not the new or modified rule is a good rule. We can know how to change the rule, but we don't know whether the rule itself is good just by appealing to the rules that are already there. So in each of these, Simon shows that formalism on its own, that is, in appealing only to the constitutive rules of the game, can't adequately address the moral questions here. In each, formalism will have to reach out beyond its narrow focus to something broader. Now, the earliest alternatives to formalism were based on the idea that players, the participants, accept, or at least implicitly accept, an understanding of how the rules should be applied. There is an implicit agreement or convention or ethos that, according to conventionalism, guides our evaluation and understanding of sport. These social conventions go beyond the rules, pulling from history and society, making it a kind of externalism. It's external to the game itself. Simon, however, argues that conventionalism, like formalism, fails to address the 3 cases we have already discussed. Now, in the case of clubless Josie, conventionalism might point to some shared understanding of how issues of sportsmanship should be addressed. However, Simon points out that cases like Josie's are probably not common enough to generate conventions about what to do. But even if they were, there's still a question about what justifies that convention. Would a convention supporting lending clubs to Josie be good for fair play or not? The conventions themselves can't speak to that. And in this way, conventionalism and formalism seem equally unable to address this key normative issue. Now, turning to strategic fouls, conventionalists argue that strategic fouls are not forms of cheating, but instead a mutually acceptable strategic practice. All participants understand and accept the use of strategic fouls in games, and so the practice is legitimized by social acceptance. Now, the fact that it is widely accepted practice can't itself provide the moral justification for the practice. That it is the case doesn't mean it should be the case. We have to be able to ask and answer the question, what justifies the convention of accepting strategic fouls in the first place? Now, this takes us to the case of rule changes in sport. Simon argues that, quote, an appeal to existing conventions cannot be the sole basis for evaluation of proposals for reform and change, end quote. Much like with formalism and its need to appeal to something beyond the rules, conventionalism must look to something else beyond its conventions to evaluate such changes. So Simon concludes this section by saying, quote, that it is hard to see how emphasis either on existing formal rules of sport or social conventions can provide a basis for the resolution of some fundamental moral issues that arise in sport, end quote. Whether it's rules or conventions, we need to find a foundation for the arguments for how best to justify the rules or conventions and their applications. Now, the answer, Simon argues, is to look to the idea of sport itself, to something internal in the nature of sport to find resolutions. Such a view will be a kind of internalism, like formalism, but one that appeals to something broader than the rules and yet still internal to sport because it's based on the nature of sport, hence broad internalism. Now, Simon pulls together several threads of thought from the philosophy of sport as well as philosophy of law to help build the theory of broad internalism. I'm going to skip directly to sort of Simon's core ideas and then how he argues it can deal with the three cases. Now, the starting point is that, quote, certain principles and theories must be presupposed if we are to make sense of key elements of sport, such as the rules, the skills that are tested, and possibly the history, traditions, and central elements of the ethos of particular sports, end quote. For example, to engage in sport with others means that we must cooperate and agree on the rules by which we play. Without presupposing this basic principle of cooperation, sport doesn't get off the ground. And this cooperative principle can be used to make sense of why sport might have certain rules, norms, or expectations about how to play the game. These presupposed principles form part of what Simon and others, such as John Russell, call the best interpretation of the game or the best explanation of the key elements of the game. This is why they are internal principles. They are not about external social conventions or a more general moral theory. They are about the elements and nature of sport itself and what principles can be adduced to make the best sense of these elements. Now, one of the principles or core ideas presupposed about sport is that it is best understood as an activity focused on maximizing challenges to be overcome and the pursuit of excellences necessary for meeting those challenges. As Simon writes, quote, sports are arenas in which we test ourselves against others, where we attempt to learn and grow through our performances, and where we attempt to develop and exhibit excellences at overcoming the sport-specific obstacles created by the rules, end quote. This view of sport is not part of the rules, but it helps to explain why a sport might have certain rules and how those rules ought to be applied in the game. For example, many sports have various kinds of offside rules to prevent one side from having too great an advantage over the other side. This is part of making sure the game is a mutual test of each participant and not too easy or too hard for one side or the other. Now, Simon connects this more directly to morality and values through the concept of, quote, sport at its best. He says, quote, if we regard the competition in sport at its best as constituting a test of excellence through creation of challenges, principles requiring an ethic of respect for the opponent and commitment to fair play are a consequence, end quote. What he means is that when we take the best version of sport or the best interpretation of what sport is, it must fundamentally contain the idea of mutual testing of excellence. This mutual testing requires that participants treat each other with a certain amount of respect and be committed to fair play. Otherwise, the test is a sham or it's incomplete. To modify that old adage, to be the best, you have to beat the best when they are playing their best on a fair playing field. Now let us look at how Simon applies this theory to the three cases. In Clubless Josie, broad internalism argues that it is praiseworthy to lend one's clubs to Josie. Sports are, quote, designed to be tests, and competitors should not avoid a worthy opponent. The justification appeals to the underlying internal principles of what sport is about. It's not appealing to rules or external social conventions. It's appealing to that sports are tests, and to have a worthy test, you need a worthy opponent. Now, in the case of strategic fouls, Simon argues that the acceptability of engaging in strategic values depends a lot on how these fouls function in the game. Are such fouls conceived as a punishment for a prohibited type of action? Or are the fouls understood as a part of a price to be paid for an option that's open to all who are willing to pay that price? The more they fit that latter conception, the more they fit with the best interpretation of the game, and so should be accepted. Now, lastly, in the case of rule changes in sport, Simon argues that modifying or changing the rules needs to be evaluated by reference to the theory of sport and to an understanding of the specific sport and the skills it is understood as testing. A rule change is good to the extent it makes the game a better test of those skills. For example, if the NFL considers moving back the yard line from which the field goal unit attempts the field goal, broad internalism argues that we need to assess this rule change based on how well this would better test the special team's skills. The rule change is evaluated by reference to the internal principles of the game. Does this make the game better or not? In all three cases, broad internalism looks to the underlying principles of sport to provide the framework for understanding and evaluating the moral questions raised by these cases. Now, Simon sums up his view in the following way. Quote, sport is an independent source of important values and contains within itself the basis for a critical evaluation of sporting practice. To the extent sport is true to its underlying ideals, it provides a defensible internal basis for an ethic of athletic competition, end quote. Broad internalism provides a means by which sport can be evaluated on its own terms and allows us to understand its core values. As Simon acknowledges, there are many forms of broad internalism. Now, Simon provides the framework for this, and philosophers of sport since have worked to develop these different forms and interpretations of broad internalism, as well as criticisms and alternatives to broad internalism, all to be examined in the future episodes of Examined Sport. Thank you for listening to Examined Sport. You can subscribe, comment, and find an archive of all shows, along with links and related information at sportsethicist.com. Please also consider rating the show at Apple Podcast, liking it on YouTube, and sharing on Facebook, Twitter, and elsewhere. You can email the show, sportsethicist@gmail.com.